You've had an impressive non-traditional career path. You got your PhD at 46, and now you've been teaching corporate strategy and leadership at Canada's top business school. Can you share a little bit about your beginnings, Glenn? Your childhood. How did you decide on your first career with the Royal Canadian Navy? And then what made you decide to leave and pivot into academia?
I grew up in a small fishing village in Newfoundland, a little place called Chanscove Trinity Bay. When I lived there, my uncle once described it as having a population of about 450, 500 people, including the cats and dogs. Um, and I was there just a couple of weeks ago, and the population now is about 217, according to one of my other uncles. Um, and I can remember standing. It's a coastal community right on the North Atlantic, and I remember standing on the shoreline one day. I was about 9 or 10, and looking out and wondering what's out there. So fast forward several years, my dad remarried. My mom died when I was 2, so that's why I was living with my grandparents in Chansco. So fast forward several years, my dad had remarried and had been posted to St. John's, Newfoundland. I started university a second time because I failed my first year at Dalhousie, but I started university a second time at Memorial University and had to play a chess game. So as part of the to determine which one of the two opponents, myself or my opponent, would make the Memorial chess team. And the guy I had to play against turned out to be a Naval Reserve officer. And my father at the time was the staff officer in charge of the Reg Force component at the Naval Reserve Division where this officer served. So he said to me when we were trying to arrange a time to play the game, he said to determine who would be the fourth player on the 4-person Mon chess team. He said, why don't you come down to the Naval Reserve Division tonight with your dad and we'll play the game after I finish work. So that's what I did. But when I got down there, I found out they were recruiting for the Reserve Officer University Training Plan. So I decided to apply. Got accepted, much to the chagrin of my dad, who did not want me to go in the Navy, and served in the Reserve Navy for about a year and a half, and then decided it was a better deal to join the Reg Force. So I joined the Regular Force Navy as an officer cadet, and technically for 7 years, but stayed for a total of 20 years. I had the opportunity to navigate several ships in the Canadian Navy and to command small training ships before I left the Navy. What's interesting is that at one point in my naval career, myself and one of my commanding officers were not getting along. So he asked for my replacement. In effect, I got fired, got transferred, posted into a non-naval job where my boss, an Army major, said to me at one point, Glenn, the type of job you're going into, there's not a lot to do. We just need someone there in case to handle a situation as it develops. And he said, you might want to take some courses. So I signed up to do my Master's of Business Administration. This was in winter of 1983. And so I did my MBA part-time over the next 3 years, and the Navy graciously allowed me to stay in that job for the 3.5 years to complete my MBA part-time and finished in 86. At that point, I got access to all of my evaluations. My wife went through them. And she said, Glenn, on operational ships, you get pretty good evaluations. Well, except for that one time you got fired. But she said, and even then you got a pretty good evaluation for having gotten fired. But when you're on training ships, and I spent a fair amount of my career on training ships, she said, you get better PERs on average on training ships. Do you think you're a teacher? So finishing my MBA, my wife assessing me like that from her experience as an elementary school teacher. And at the same time, my dean, who I'd had as an undergrad and as an MBA student, asked if I would be willing to teach part-time. So I said yes, and I did that over the next 2 years. Then I got transferred back to Halifax for the last 2 years. And when we got to Halifax, the new dean at Memorial, the new dean of the business school, phoned and said, Glenn, I understand you could retire in about a year and a half. Why don't you come teach for us full-time? And after a couple of years, we'll support you doing your PhD. So I thought about that. My wife and I thought about it for a few months. then said, yes, let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that coming together allowed me to shift careers. One of the things that's really interesting, and sometimes I get asked, what was it like transferring from the Navy to academia?
Right.
I can honestly say it was one of the most seamless transitions that I've ever had in career changes. And I think there are several reasons for that. Number one, I have a propensity to do research. I really enjoy doing research. The other thing that hit me as I thought back on it and reflected on it, there's a verse in the Bible that asks, if you teach, do you not also learn? And in the secular world, we now paraphrase that to say to teach is to learn twice. Reflecting back on that, one of the things I really enjoyed was helping other students. And then I realized that, as my wife pointed out, a fair proportion of my career in the Navy was teaching, junior officers. So in effect, I went from one teaching venue to another teaching venue. The other thing that really helped with that transition from the Navy to academia was the fact that the course I taught, well, one of the two courses I taught was the same course I taught when I taught part-time while I was still in the Navy. Well,
Which course was that?
It was Introduction to Business.
Oh, okay.
I can still remember my first night, my first class. And I'm going to take advantage of your good graces and tell this story. It was a 51-seat classroom. There were 51 people in the 51 seats. But there was one guy on the far right corner in the front row. And so I just very, nonchalantly said, hi, my name is Glenn Rowe. Just finished my MBA, and I'm going to be teaching Introduction to Business with you this fall. Any questions? And this guy put up his hand and he said, do you own your own business? I said, no. He said, do you work in business? I said, no. He said, what do you do? I said, I'm in the Navy. The look, I can still remember the look on his face, like, yeah, what are you going to teach me about business,
Right.
And I found out later that he ran his own small business. It's a business that takes tourists out in a small ship he owns, to look for whales and birds and stuff off the coast of Newfoundland. And he's still in business, so hopefully something he learned from me hopefully helped him. But anyway, I went home and told my wife, I said, oh, Faye, I had so much fun tonight. I'd do this for nothing. She said, don't tell the dean, you'll do it for nothing.
And how do you go about addressing, as you mentioned, that first time when this person who asked you those questions, and sometimes they question your credibility or your expertise. How do you address that?
Well, that's another very good question. And, for me, you just have to have confidence in, your ability to do what you're going to do. If that's difficult for you, then you have to accept that other people have confidence in you, or else you wouldn't be standing where you are.
Right.
I remember at the end of my first year in doctoral school, I'd been a teaching assistant to a professor who taught a course called project management. Now, when I started that, I couldn't spell project management, let alone be a teaching assistant or teach the course. But the idea was that I would be a teaching assistant for 2 semesters, and then I would be the prof of record teaching the project management course for the next year or so. And the first time I taught that course was my summer of '93. In the month of August. And it was 5 weeks, 5 days per week, 1 class per day. So 25, 24 classes, whatever it was, over that 5-week period. And at the end of the first week, the chair of my department, an amazingly great leader, Don Hellriegel, and he came to see me and he said, Glenn, I've had now understand, I'm not a newbie teacher at this point. I have taught before. I've been in the Navy. I'm not a brand new PhD, 29 years old, coming out of the doctoral program. But anyway, he came to see me. He said, Glenn, I've had a couple of students come see me, and they're a little concerned about what they're going to learn from you in this project management course. What do you think? And I looked at him and I said, well, Don, if I were in your shoes, I'd be concerned too. But why don't we just see how it goes? And say, okay, let's do that. And it worked out okay. But, you've got to have confidence in yourself.
That's it. Yeah. So you had that from the beginning, Glenn, or did you have to work? You did from the very beginning.
No, I think I love teaching so much and maybe
The
didn't
passion.
realize it,
Right.
but I had a passion for teaching and a passion for disseminating information that
Mm-hmm.
that I think transcended the questioning of my credibility to do so.